The submarine changed the very nature of naval warfare during the Great War. Navies had developed few weapons or tactics to effectively deal with them, and in the early months of the First World War, the U-boats of the Imperial German Navy proved that they could be a real threat to the ships of the Royal Navy. But on August 9, 1914, the submarine U-15 encountered the light cruiser HMS Birmingham, and Birmingham used what was at the time the single most effective method for a warship to sink a submarine. The tactic of ramming submarines during the Great War deserves to be remembered. In his 2003 book, The German Submarine War, author Richard Henry Gibson explains that on August 6th, just 2 days after Britain declared war on Germany, 10 undersea boats of the Imperial German Navy set out on the first war cruise. Gibson writes, "No cruise so adventurous, so far-reaching, had ever been attempted before." The boats were U-5, 7, 8, 9, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. These represented nearly the whole of the serviceable submarine fleet of the Imperial Navy. Dr. Martin Gibson of Glasgow University explained on his blog War and Security in 2014. In 1914, Germany possessed only 24 operational boats. Another 4 were used for training, and 16 were under construction. Only 10 of the operational boats had diesel engines, the others using courting heavy fuel oil engines that produced a great deal of smoke and sparks. Their mission was to understand the intentions of the Royal Navy. R.H. Gibson writes, the U-boats were to advance up the North Sea as far as the Norway Orkneys in an attempt to divine the British naval dispositions. This was the first confrontation between the great ships of the Royal Navy and the new threats of the undersea boats. On August 8th, near Shetland's Fair Isle, U-15 fired a torpedo at the battleship HMS Monarch, at the time engaging in gunnery practice. Roger Keyes, commander of the Royal Navy's 8th Submarine Flotilla, would later comment that the fact that the Monarch was performing such a task within 500 miles of Helgoland was an example of the Navy's general ignorance of submarine powers and limitations. But the attack was unsuccessful. The torpedo narrowly missed Monarch and alerted the fleet that submarines were in the area. R.H. Gibson describes the response. The Leviathans sheared out of the line to ram, but did not crush their opponent with their bulk. In this first contact between the Royal Navy and the Kaiser's submarines, both sides failed to score a hit. But the next day, the U-15 would run out of luck. The boat appears to have suffered engine failure, was on the surface when through heavy fog it was sighted by the light cruiser, HMS Birmingham. Newspaper reports were heavily censored. On August 14th, the Kensington News and West London Times talked of the Birmingham's fine gunnery and reported that the Birmingham had scored 2 hits with their 6-inch guns, one blowing off the submarine's periscope and the second tearing off its conning tower. However, the truth was somewhat different. R.H. Gibson writes, it would seem that no watch was being kept in the submarine, and from the sounds of hammering which pierced the haze, the crew was apparently trying to remedy an engine breakdown. Altering course and ensuring that the U-15 was within her turning circle, the Birmingham bore down, opening a rapid fire at close range. The submarine slowly began to move through the water, but it was too late. The bows of the light cruiser caught her fair and square, cutting her completely in 2. The Royal Navy was not able to spare Birmingham for immediate repairs. R.H. Gibson writes that for several months the Birmingham bore evidence of her success in the shape of 2 long scars, most exactly symmetrical in length and pattern, which defaced her bows. If the newspaper reports were not forthright on the tactics, they did not miss the significance. The Birmingham was the first warship to sink a submarine in the Great War. The cruise turns out to have been a disaster for the Imperial German Navy. In addition to the U-15, the U-13 failed to return, presumed to have been lost to a mine. R.H. Gibson notes dryly, not even the hardiest optimist could pretend that the submarine had vindicated its war value by this expedition. The attack by HMS Birmingham certainly required luck to have the submarine caught unaware on the surface, but the tactic of ramming, at least with a vessel as large as the 5,500-ton Birmingham, certainly proved deadly for the Kaiser's U-boats. HMS Birmingham would not be alone in her choice of tactic. Journalist Patrick Boniface noted in a 2018 edition of Military History magazine, during the First World War, 19 German submarines were dispatched with the use of ramming. At the time, the technology to detect, localize, and destroy submarines was rudimentary at best, and one of the quickest ways to deal with the threat of a periscope was to turn and run over the enemy at top speed. But the U-boats would certainly get their revenge for the loss of the U-15. On September 5th, the submarine U-21 became the first submarine to sink a ship with a self-propelled torpedo, sinking the scout cruiser HMS Pathfinder. And on September 22nd, the U-9 encountered and sank 3 older Royal Navy armored cruisers, HMS Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy, for a loss of nearly 1,500 lives. A month later, the U-9 sank the protected cruiser HMS Hawke. The U-boats were suddenly demonstrating their war value. The October newspaper reported another U-boat sunk, this time by the destroyer HMS Badger. The Crediton Chronicle and North Devon Gazette reported that a German submarine has been rammed and sunk by the destroyer Badger off the Dutch coast. The Badger's bows were somewhat damaged. And the Staffordshire Sentinel reported that her commander and crew had an enthusiastic reception, cheer after cheer being given by the warship crews in the harbor. While this time the newspapers reported the ramming, again the reality was different than what was in the newspaper. The Badger, which struck the U-19 in what Gibson called pitch darkness, was at 990 tons, barely larger than the 837-ton submarine. By November, the Bristol Times and Mirror asked, did the HMS Badger destroy the German submarine she rammed? That is still the subject of heated discussion among some argumentative people. The reason for the question, the paper reported, was that the Badger's bow was crumpled, and the crew believed the submarine sank to rise no more. But the Germans say she has returned safely to port. But the paper was skeptical of the German claim, noting that Germans do not give her number and any details. And it is to be noted that the collision is almost always fatal to a submarine when it is she who was struck. The paper concludes that putting 2 and 2 together, it would seem that the Admiralty's very pleased telegram to the Badger was justified. But the Admiralty and the Bristol Times and Mirror were wrong. The submarine struck was the U-19, and while severely damaged, the boat made it back to its base for repairs. Gibson notes that the U-19 made many and amazing escapes during the Great War, surviving to be surrendered after the armistice. The survival of U-19 and damage to HMS Badger demonstrated the risks involved as well. Boniface notes that it was by no means a one-way affair, since submarines were built strongly to resist water pressure at great depth. That risk was demonstrated in May of 1918. The aged destroyer HMS Fairy was escorting a convoy off of Britain's east coast when the convoy came under attack by the submarine UC-75. The 22-year-old destroyer actually displaced less than the mine-laying submarine, but nonetheless, R.H. Gibson writes, the submarine, failing to take precautions, was rammed by the destroyer. The commander of HMS Fairy, Lieutenant Geoffrey Barnish, reported that the convoy was steaming in darkness. At 2:05, I heard a heavy crash from the direction of the convoy, like the detonation of a torpedo. The officer of the watch, Lieutenant Bennett, had sounded the alarm. We increased speed and headed for the source of the noise. The men poured up on deck, and a few seconds later a surface submarine was sighted off the port bow at a distance of 300 yards. I ordered the coxswain to port to helm in order to hit her in a more vital spot, but we were too close for the helm to have any effect and quickly passed over the stern of our enemy. There was no obvious force of impact at this time, and I fear we probably damaged ourselves more than we did him. However, on passing over him, I determined to renew the attack by ram, and sending the gunner aft to open fire with our after gun, proceeded to turn the Fairy round. The submarine fired her gun, but we shelled her from point-blank range with the after 6-pounder, and all 40 direct hits were made. The Germans on the submarine's bridge now jumped into the water as we came up again with our ram. The destroyer's bows struck the U-boat close beside the gun. It was a brave action, but too much for the small destroyer. Barnish reported, how far our stern buckled is uncertain, but within seconds our foredeck was under water and the submarine had disappeared, leaving 2 Germans calmly standing on our submerged forecastle with their hands held up. Signals were sent reporting our damage, boats were put over the side, and the prisoners were taken charge of and searched. The artificer engineer, Lieutenant Palmer, reported extensive damage to the hull, and it was decided to steam very slowly towards the beach. However, this was too much strain for the bulkhead forward, and efforts were then made to steam her stern first. This was very soon useless, as both propellers were out of the water. Engines were then stopped. The crew embarked into the boats and ordered to lie off at a safe distance. A last message was sent to Captain D by wireless, informing him we were about to abandon the Fairy. The attack demonstrated the danger of ramming. In sinking UC-75, the Fairy was sunk herself. Lieutenant Barnish received the Distinguished Service Order for the action. But being just too darn small was not an issue in one of the most extraordinary examples of a Royal Navy ship ramming a submarine during the Great War. HMS Dreadnought was the pride of the fleet when she was commissioned in 1906. BBC noted in 2013, Dreadnought brought together for the first time a series of technologies which had been developing over several years. Most important was her firepower. She was the first all-big-gun battleship, with 10 12-inch guns. The BBC quoted John Roberts of the Museum of Naval Firepower. Dreadnought really transformed naval warfare rather like the tank did on land warfare. In fact, Dreadnought was described at the time as the most deadly fighting machine ever launched in the history of the world. And yet, for the ship whose radical design transformed naval warfare and started the naval arms race that, some argue, was instrumental in starting the Great War, King George V's pride only sank a single vessel at sea. Robert Farley wrote in the National Interest in 2018, on March 18th, U-29 encountered a portion of the Grand Fleet on exercise in Pentland Firth in the Orkney Islands. U-29 fired a torpedo at the battleship HMS Neptune, but missed. And as was often the case with World War I submarines, the boat inadvertently broke the surface after firing the torpedo, which gave HMS Dreadnought and another battleship, HMS Temeraire, a chance to sight her. It might have been dangerous for the 35-ton HMS Fairy to ram a U-boat, but not so much for the 20,000-ton Dreadnought. Farley writes, after a chase that lasted only a few minutes and almost involved a collision between Dreadnought and Temeraire, the former rammed U-29 and cut the submarine in half. To illustrate the risk on both sides, U-29 was lost with all hands, including its captain, Otto Vettigen. It had been Vettigen who commanded the U-9 in 1914 when it sank the Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy. Dreadnought saw little other action during the war, but the vessel once designated the most deadly fighting machine ever launched in the history of the world did have the distinction of being the only battleship in history to sink a submarine. But Dreadnought was not the largest vessel to ram and sink a submarine during the Great War. When she was launched in October 1910, RMS Olympic, sister ship to the Titanic, was at more than 45,000 gross registered tons, the largest ship in the world. Requisitioned as a troop ship in 1915, having naval guns mounted, Boniface explains, in the early hours of 12 May 1918, U-103 targeted the sister ship of Titanic, the RMS Olympic. The great liner was carrying American troops to France. The crew of U-103 were unable, however, to flood the two stern torpedo tubes, and tragically, as it turned out for the submarine, they decided to surface to attack the liner. U-103 immediately came under fire from the Olympic's gunners, while the captain swung his ship round to try and run the submarine down. U-103 crash-dived to a depth of 30 meters, but almost immediately the liner's port propeller sliced through the submarine's pressure hull. With the boat surely sinking, the crew of the submarine blew the ballast tanks and scuttled the boat. 9 crewmen lost their lives. In another irony, in 1911, Olympic had survived a collision with HMS Hawke, the same vessel that was sunk by the U-9 in 1914. The submarine really came of age during the Great War, but so did weapons to counter them. Far more U-boats were sunk by mines than by ships, and by the end of the war, depth charges had become much more reliable and deadly. Still, ramming was used throughout the war. The sinking of U-15 by HMS Birmingham in 1914 represented the first U-boat sunk, but the sinking of the UB-110 after being rammed by the destroyer HMS Gary in 1918 was among the last. And the strategy of ramming submarines continued to be a common strategy throughout the Second World War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.